The screech of tires on asphalt sounded like the crack of the sky tearing up. Lisa froze, clenching the leash with trembling fingers. She didn't see the car hurtling toward her, but she heard it, the roar of the engine, as loud as thunder, and the ominous whisper of the crowd holding its breath. Her heart beat in a frantic rhythm, and her breathing became ragged. At that moment, Thora, her faithful golden retriever, yanked the leash sharply, pulling the girl aside, saving her at the last moment. Lisa fell to her knees, feeling Thora's fur under her palms, warm and reassuring. Tears rolled down her cheeks, a mixture of fear and gratitude. "You saved me, girl," she whispered, wrapping her arms around the dog's neck. She was only 9, but she already knew what darkness was. She lived in it. Lisa lost her sight 2 years ago. An accident, the doctors said. An accident that left her in pitch-black darkness. The world was gone. Her parents' faces, her favorite books with bright pictures, the morning sun beaming through the curtains. It was all just a memory, faded and distant, like a forgotten dream. The first months after the tragedy were hell. She wandered in the void, stumbling over objects that used to seem so simple and understandable. Her mother cried nights. Her father averted his gaze full of helplessness. But one day, a ray of light appeared in their home, a puppy whose paws thumped loudly on the wooden floor, whose tail scattered dust in the corners. Lisa immediately named her Thora, after the Scandinavian god of thunder. Maybe because she was so lacking in strength herself. At first, Thora was just a sweet puppy, mischievous and clumsy, but she quickly became something more. Under the guidance of a trainer, the dog learned to lead Lisa through the streets, to protect her from danger, to be her eyes, and, more importantly, Thora became her friend, faithful, reliable, unwavering. With her arrival, Lisa's world was once again filled with sounds, smells, and textures that she feared she would lose forever. The Thora not only showed the way, but also reflected dangers. One day, a teenager threw a bottle that flew dangerously close to Lisa. Thora roared so that boy ran away. She was always on guard, always ready to stand between Lisa and the world that was so often cruel to her. But not everyone liked it. There were those who looked at Lisa with contempt, whispered behind her back, mocked her blindness. And every time this happened, Thora reached for her hand as if to say, "I'm here. We'll make it." This morning, there was no sign of trouble. Lisa and Thora were walking along a quiet alley in the park. Lisa held the leash and talked to Thora, telling her about her last dream, in which they were running along the endless beach. She couldn't see the sun playing in Thora's golden fur, but she could feel her warmth. She didn't know that this day would change everything, that a few blocks away from them, a chain of events had already begun that would soon tear her life into a before and after. Thora, her light in the darkness, was about to fall victim to a world where kindness and loyalty sometimes mean nothing in the face of prejudice and cruelty. Screams tore the air. Police sirens merged into a chaotic howl that vibrated in my chest like a warning of danger. Lisa felt it before she heard it. A sharp gust of wind brought to her the smell of sweat, metal, and fear. Something was happening up ahead. Something tense and unnatural. Thora stopped. Her body tensed like a taut string. Lisa knew what that meant. She squeezed the leash tighter. "What is it, girl?" she asked in a whisper, trying to suppress the tremor in her voice. But the answer came not from Thora, but from a sharp sound, heavy footsteps running straight at them. The policeman shouted, chasing the suspect. His voice, rough and harsh, came closer and closer. "Stay where you are. Don't move." Thora roared, low and menacing as never before. Lisa instinctively braced herself against the dog, but didn't move. She'd always been told that in a dangerous situation it was best to stay put and wait for help. She opened her mouth to explain, but her voice was drowned in the din of events. It's too late. A policeman jumped out from around the corner, his face twisted with tension and anger. A weapon gleamed in his hands. His gaze fell on Thora, standing in front of Lisa, snarling, fur raised. She seemed formidable, defending her mistress, but her threat was illusory. This was a dog trained to help, not attack. But the policeman didn't know that, or didn't want to know. "Get the dog out! Put it away now!" he shouted. Lisa froze, confused. She held up her hands, trying to look non-threatening, but her words sounded too quiet amidst the chaos. "It's not dangerous. It's a guide. I'm blind." But he was not listening. All his attention was focused on Thor. His fingers clutched the weapon nervously. Shot. Deafening. Like a lightning strike. Lisa felt the leash loosen, as if the world around her was falling apart. "Thora!" Her scream cut through the silence that came after the gunshot. She sank to her knees, reaching her hands forward, but her fingers met only wet, hot fur. Thora didn't move again. The policeman lowered his weapon, his face pale. She attacked me," he muttered, but even his voice sounded uncertain. The girl sat on the cold pavement, her hands bloody, her face in tears. She sobbed, calling for Thora, but her dog could no longer hear her. "You killed her," she screamed, her voice becoming hoarse with grief. "She was mine, my eyes, my family." The policeman took a step back, shaken by her words. He had thought this had been a routine incident, a threat he had eliminated. But now he saw not the threat, but the destroyed girl, her tears, and the dog's motionless body. People began to gather around. Whispers filled the air. "It's the guide. She's blind. How could he?" The policeman, sensing the growing condemnation, tried to explain something, but his words were drowned out by the indignation of the crowd and Lisa's inconsolable crying. At that moment he realized he had not just made a mistake, he had destroyed someone's life. But the girl heard nothing more. She clung to Thora's body, as if her warmth could bring her back to life. There was only one thought in her head. The world is dark again, and this time forever. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you are listening to our stories from, whether you have faced similar situations in your life, and share your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next chapters of this exciting story. And now we continue. The gunshot shattered the silence like a lightning strike on a windless night. Lisa felt it with a sound, a vibration, a cold emptiness that rushed into her chest, freezing her breath. At first, she didn't realize what had happened. Everything around her froze. The footsteps, the screams, even the wind that ruffled her hair. It was as if the world had stopped waiting. And only then did she realize it. The leash in her hand collapsed like a rag doll, and a thick metallic odor wafted through the air. Lisa fell to her knees, frantically fumbling in the darkness in front of her. Her fingers fumbled with Thora's warm fur, but there was no more movement, no breathing, no response. "Thora!" Lisa's voice sounded like a desperate cry ripping through her chest. She shook the dog, cradling its head against her, as if she could bring life back with her warmth. "Get up! Please get up!" Tears burned her face like hot needles. She called her name over and over until the hysteria turned into a hoarse, incoherent whisper. The policeman stood nearby, gun clutched in his hand. His face was stony, but his eyes betrayed confusion. He tried to collect his thoughts, to justify what he had just done. She attacked. It was a threat. I acted by the book, he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else, but the words sounded muffled, as if he didn't believe them himself. Lisa turned her head sharply at the sound of his voice. "You killed her!" she shrieked shrilly, her voice soaked with grief and anger. She stood up, wobbling as if her legs could no longer hold her weight. Her hands trembled, pointing somewhere in the void, but the words hit exactly on target. "She was my eyes. You didn't even listen to me." The policeman took a step back, embarrassed by her words, but then his face stiffened again. He coughed, trying to give himself confidence. "Girl, I didn't know. She looked aggressive. I thought she was going to attack. It was a mistake." "A mistake?" Lisa wheezed with rage. "That was my family. You killed her." She fell to the ground, hugging Thora's motionless body, her slender fingers entwined with her fur. People began to gather around, their whispers filling the air like invisible snakes. "She's blind. It's the guide. How could he?" they said. But the policeman heard only the girl's voice. He tried to say something, to justify himself, but all his words were lost in the noise. He stood there, gun in hand, as if it could protect him from reality. Every second seemed like an eternity. Lisa was no longer crying. Her face was frozen in a mask of horror and hopelessness. Her world, already dark, was now unbearably cold and empty. The policeman took a step toward her, but she threw her hands up as if defending herself. "Stay back," she hissed, her voice full of hate. He froze. People around him continued to watch, some already pulling out their phones, recording this tragedy. For Lisa, the moment of the gunshot was the point of no return. She hadn't just lost a dog. She had lost the only thing that made her life even slightly brighter. Now there was only darkness left, and she knew that nothing could dull that pain. Lisa knelt beside Thora's still body. Her hands trembled, soaked with the clammy warmth of blood. The people around them began to move closer, but no one dared to get too close. The crowd was divided into those who were taking pictures on their phones and those who were frozen in horror, watching the little girl broken by grief. The policeman holstered his gun with a noisy exhalation. His face contorted in a grimace of irritation, and he stepped closer to Lisa. "You were supposed to have your dog under control." His voice was cold and harsh, like a rusty knife ripping through the silence. He didn't look her in the eye, didn't notice her tears, as if she was just an inconvenient problem, not a child who had lost her only friend. Lisa lifted her head. Her eyes, closed forever from the light, still looked directly at him, as if trying to burn right through him. "She was my guide, my eyes. You killed her," she shouted, her voice full of pain and rage, but the policeman only snorted. "You have no idea the situation I was in. I had to make a decision. It's not my fault you couldn't handle a dog." His words sounded not only rude but drenched in contempt. He seemed to see her as neither a child nor a human being, only an unpleasant problem that needed to be fixed as quickly as possible. Lisa jumped to her feet, her hands clenched into fists. "How can you say that? She saved me every day. You didn't even let me explain." Her voice shook, but she didn't back down. The crowd around her began to murmur, the growing resentment turning into visible pressure. "Hey, maybe you should at least apologize," shouted someone in the audience. Another added, "She's a child. She's blind. What the hell are you doing?" The policeman, hearing these words, sighed and looked back at the men. His face became hard, almost angry. "You don't understand anything," he bellowed, glaring around the crowd. "I was protecting all of you. That dog could have lunged at me or anyone else. You want me to risk my life?" But his words didn't elicit any sympathy. Lisa's gaze became even more penetrating, though she couldn't see where it was directed. "You didn't protect anyone. You destroyed my world. She was the only thing I had." She dropped to her knees beside Thora again, her arms gently hugging the dog's motionless body. Instead of answering, the policeman exhaled loudly, rolled his eyes, and waved his hand as if chasing away a pesky fly. "I don't have time to look at this. If you have a complaint, talk to the station. We don't have time for tears and tantrums," he said, turning around as if it was over. But his voice sounded like an icy prick that dug even deeper into the girl's heart. The crowd around him began to fill with anger. People shouted words of condemnation at the policeman. Some demanded his suspension, but he didn't stop. It was just another normal day of duty for him. He walked forward, leaving behind the girl, her dead dog, and the growing rumble of outrage. Lisa remained on her knees, feeling the darkness in which she had lived was now cold, hostile, and impenetrable. Thora had been her protection, her friend, her light, and now she was no more, and in front of her stood a system, indifferent and cruel, that saw her grief as nothing but a nuisance. The crowd began to disperse, but one question remained in the air. How could a girl's life have been so ruthlessly destroyed in a single moment that no one could now undo? The phone rang at the most inopportune moment. Senator William Hendricks had just finished a meeting with key party leaders. Their conversation centered on social reform, his longtime goal of improving the lives of the vulnerable. But as soon as the call rang out, all that instantly lost importance. He answered without looking at the screen, his voice sounding tired but firm. "Hendricks here." On the other end of the line, the voice was intermittent, excited. It was Lisa's personal assistant who accompanied her on her walks. "Sir, it's Lisa." The voice trembled as if each word burned. Hendricks tensed instantly, his face contorted as a cold hand squeezed his heart. "What's wrong with my daughter?" he asked, his voice low and threatening. "She's fine, physically, but sir, it's a tragedy. Her dog, Thora, is dead. A policeman shot her." There was silence in the receiver for a moment. Hendricks couldn't find the words right away. He stood up from the table, his fingers clenched into a fist. "Say it again," he whispered, though everything had already been said. "The policeman shot her dog. He said Thora was a threat. But sir, people say he didn't even listen to Lisa. She tried to explain that it was her guide dog. He just ignored her." The senator sank slowly to the edge of the table, covering his face with his hand. He felt anger, but even stronger was the pain. Lisa had lost her sight, but with Thora she had regained her freedom. That dog wasn't just an animal, it was part of her soul. And now it had been taken away, so easily, so indifferently. He took a deep breath, trying to pull himself together. "Where is my daughter now?" he asked, his voice hard again, almost icy. "She's still there, with the crowd. The cop left, but the people, they videotaped the whole thing. It's already starting to go viral on the internet. You need to get over here right away, sir." Hendricks didn't wait for an explanation. He had already called his driver, demanding that the car be ready. His secretary tried to tell him something about important meetings, but he just waved his hand without listening. None of that mattered now. On the way to the scene, he stared out the window while a storm grew inside him. This wasn't just an act of violence against his daughter. It was an act that reflected everything he had fought against for years. A soulless system ready to trample on those who were weaker. It didn't matter if it was a blind girl or anyone else who didn't fit their stereotypes. When the car stopped, the crowd had not yet dispersed. People turned around as they saw the senator approaching. His tall figure, his stern gaze, his angry eyes were impossible to miss. He approached Lisa, still sitting on the pavement, and gently touched her shoulder. "Daddy," she whispered. There was pain and weakness in her voice. He knelt down beside her, hugging her tightly, as if protecting her from the world. "I'm here, Lisa. Everything's going to be all right," he said, though he knew himself that nothing would ever be the same again. Then his gaze fell on Thora's still body, and something inside him snapped. He rose and looked at the crowd. His voice cut through the air like a roll of thunder. "Who was that officer? I want to know his name. I want to know why he thought he had the right to ruin my child's life." The crowd buzzed. Someone shouted that he had a video. Another relayed the officer's name. Hendricks memorized everything, his mind already working at full capacity. But in this moment, he wasn't a senator. He was a father who had seen the system strike his daughter. He knew that this was just the beginning, and that there was no stopping this storm. The next morning, the tragedy was on the front pages of the news media. Senator William Hendricks, known for his fight for justice, did the impossible. He turned his daughter's personal tragedy into a high-profile case that galvanized the entire country. Every minute of what happened near the park was captured on camera and posted online. The video of Lisa sobbing over the motionless body of her dog and the policeman coldly waving away her grief went viral. The news channels wasted no time. The screen showed close-ups of a little girl sitting on the sidewalk and her last desperate "Thora" that broke the hearts of millions. The reports were accompanied by footage of the senator hugging his daughter and his resounding declaration, "My daughter didn't just lose a dog. She lost her eyes. She lost a friend. And we've all lost faith in the system that's supposed to protect us." Social media exploded. The hashtag #Justice for Lisa became a trend within hours. Thousands of people spoke out in support of the girl, demanding punishment for the police officer who made a fatal mistake. But the wave of outrage was far from uniform. On one side are those who saw Lisa as a symbol of vulnerability, of being exposed to the cruelty of the system. "How can you justify killing a guide dog? It's not just a dog, it's her life," people wrote. In the comments to the video, there were stories of other victims of police aggression whose fates remained unnoticed. For them, Lisa became the voice they never had. But there was another side to the story. Comments began appearing on social media and on news talk shows justifying the police officer's actions. The dog growled. He was defending himself. He didn't have time to deal with it, they claimed. Some argued that the senator was using his daughter's tragedy for political purposes, trying to score points on a wave of sympathy. The controversy flared up with renewed vigor when the policeman himself came on the air. His face was grim but confident. "I acted by the book. In the face of the threat, I made the decision I felt was right. I could not risk my life or the safety of others," he declared. But his excuses sounded dry, almost mechanical, and elicited no sympathy from most of the audience. The senator was not left out. He came out with an official statement that instantly went viral. "This case is not about the right to police protection. This case is about how easily our system ignores the voices of the weak, how often those who need help are seen as a threat, and that has to change. However, even his words could not completely silence the critics. The questions multiplied. What if it had not been the senator's daughter, but an ordinary girl? Would we even be talking about this? Or, why has this incident been turned into a national tragedy when so many people face police aggression every day? In the studios of news channels and on the pages of social networks, real war of words began. Public activists called for reforms. Celebrities published posts in support of Lisa. But each support was accompanied by attacks. Police unions issued statements. We will not allow officers to be attacked for doing their job. In this chaos, Lisa remained in the shadows. She did not give interviews, did not talk to journalists. Her father had made the decision to protect her from the noise, but the girl felt that the world around her had become even louder and heavier. Her small room, where she used to spend evenings with Thora, was now filled with a silence that throbbed with pain. And while the country argued, Lisa sat on the bed, holding an old Thora collar. Her mind was spinning with unanswered questions. Why did this happen? Why hadn't she been heard? And, most importantly, was there anything she could have done to stop this nightmare? The senator knew. This case would transcend personal tragedy. It would become a movement. But he also knew that every battle has a price, and the highest price was his daughter. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from, whether you have had similar situations in your life, and how you dealt with them. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the continuation of this story. And now we continue. The information reached Officer Gerald Miller sooner than he expected. In the morning, as soon as he crossed the threshold of the station, he was met with wary looks from his co-workers. No one said anything, but the atmosphere spoke for itself. Whispers behind him, muffled conversation at the coffee machine. Miller had always considered himself a man of the system, someone who followed protocols and didn't make mistakes. But this time, something had gone wrong. Very wrong. He had barely had time to sit down at his desk when he was summoned by his supervisor. As he climbed the stairs, Miller already knew it was going to be an unpleasant conversation. He pushed open the door, and the captain's face met his with a grim expression. On the desk in front of him lay papers, and the laptop screen glowed with an open page of a news portal. On it was a frozen shot of a girl sitting on the pavement, hugging her dead dog. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" began the captain without looking up. Miller wanted to object but didn't have time. "It wasn't just any girl, Miller. It was Senator Hendrick's daughter. Do you realize the magnitude of this situation? It's everywhere. Every news outlet, every newspaper, social media. People want your head." Miller tried to pull himself together. He stood up straight, clasping his hands behind his back. "I acted in accordance with the statute. The dog was acting aggressive. I didn't have time to sort out who it was or whose it was." The captain raised his head sharply. His gaze burned through Miller. "By the bylaws? Are you telling me about the charter now? The dog was a guide, Miller, a guide for a blind girl, and you didn't even bother to listen to her." The captain's voice grew louder and louder, like the deafening roar of thunder before a storm. "And now it's all on us, on the department, on all of us." Miller fell silent. For the first time in his many years of service, he felt the ground beneath him begin to shake. He wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, images of yesterday's incident flashed before his eyes. The dog, the girl, her scream. At the time, it had seemed to him that he had done the right thing. Now, those images were a nightmare that wouldn't let go. After speaking with the captain, Miller returned to his desk, but his work was not going well. His phone was ringing off the hook. Colleagues from other precincts, friends he'd talked to for years, were now calling with one question. Is it true, Gerald? Is it really you? Even his wife sent a dry message, "We need to talk." By noon, news that the dog belonged to the senator's daughter was everywhere. Journalists filled the streets in front of the precinct. Miller looked out the window and felt sick to his stomach. Cameras, microphones, people with banners. He hadn't had time to properly grasp the magnitude of what had happened, but now it was obvious. He hadn't just made a mistake. He had ruined a child's life, and with it, his own. In the evening, he finally decided to watch the video. His hands were shaking as he turned on his phone. The first seconds seemed unbearable to him. Lisa sat on the ground, cuddling the dog, and her screaming tore at his soul. He noticed how he stood back, cold, detached, and said something that now sounded like a taunt. It was a threat, he had uttered then. And now those words seemed murderous to him. Miller turned off the video, but the images didn't disappear from his head. They came back again and again, burning his mind, making his heart beat faster. He realized it would haunt him for the rest of his life. His wife was waiting for him at home. She stood at the door with an expression that mingled disappointment and weariness. "Gerald, what have you done?" Her voice was quiet, but it lacked the usual warmth. "I saw the video. How could you do that to a child?" Miller lowered his gaze. He wanted to justify himself, to explain that he was sure he'd done the right thing. But the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he whispered, "I didn't know. I just didn't know." The wife shook her head. "That's no excuse, and you know it." At night, he did not sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the girl's face. He heard her scream. He remembered looking down at her as if she were nothing, not a child who had lost everything. He felt a weight growing inside him that couldn't be shaken off. The next day, he was again summoned to the captain's office. "You are suspended from duty pending an investigation," the man informed him coldly. "And, Gerald, don't even think it will end there. Senator Hendricks will go all the way, and he won't rest until you pay for your mistake." As Miller walked out of his office, he was bombarded by the buzz of journalists' voices. Cameras followed his every move. People were shouting accusations, demanding justice, and somewhere in that crowd, he heard the voice of a little girl. Not Lisa's, but someone else's. But those words cut him like a knife. He killed her dog. Why didn't he apologize? Miller stopped. He realized there was nothing more he could do to fix it. His mistake had already become part of something bigger. But he also realized something else. In his own eyes, in the eyes of his family, in the eyes of the world, he was no longer a man. He is only the one who destroyed the light in the little girl's life. The video of the incident with Lisa and her dog continued to spread across the internet like wildfire, setting every platform, every news feed ablaze. On the surface, it was a tragedy that could have remained personal. The loss of a child, a blind girl, her irreplaceable guide. But there was more to the story than that, and society felt it. With each new article, with each comment under the video, not only the wounds of one family but also the pustules of the whole system were opened. The questions multiplied like black clouds on the horizon before a storm. Why had the policeman, instead of dealing with the situation, chosen the path of violence? Why was his behavior toward Lisa, toward the little black girl, so cold, so devoid of basic humanity? This case was a trigger for a country that has long lived under the weight of unresolved problems of racism and police brutality. One after another, TV channels devoted special programs to the incident. Some heatedly debated how Lisa's skin color could have played a role in her words being ignored. Others focused on her blindness, calling the incident a blatant example of discrimination against people with disabilities. Lisa was turned into a symbol of struggle, but no one asked if she was ready for the role. She was a child crushed by the weight of a world that seemed to suddenly notice her only after she had lost her most precious possessions. In the studios of famous talk shows sat representatives of both sides. At one table were Senator Hendricks' lawyers, activists demanding justice, and those who saw Lisa as the embodiment of all victims of systemic injustice. At the other, police unions, government officials who defended Miller and argued that his actions were justified under stress. "We can't judge an officer for the seconds he spent under threat," a police spokesman said, his voice sounding firm but strained. "He saw a dog that could have attacked. How could he have known she was a guide dog?" "Are you serious?" interrupted the activist, pointing to the screen where the video of Lisa was playing over and over again. That little girl was screaming. She was saying the dog was her guide. She tried to explain, but she was ignored. Why? Because she's black? Because she's blind? The question hung in the air like a thundercloud ready to burst into lightning. No one had anything to say in response, but the public on the internet was not silent. The comments discussed every detail, and most agreed that Lisa, like many before her, was a victim of a system that was used to looking at skin color, not the person. Incidents like this have happened before. There have been too many. The stories of African Americans wrongfully accused, beaten, killed by police had long been part of the national conversation. But Lisa's case added a new element. She was a blind girl who had lost everything, and now the country couldn't look away. Protests began in the streets of cities. Thousands of people gathered under banners reading "Justice for Lisa," "Systemic racism kills," and "Enough violence." Among them were parents with children who felt Lisa's pain as their own. There were those who had themselves lost loved ones to police brutality. There were the blind who took to the streets with white canes to remind the world that their lives matter too. But along with the support came threats. Senator Hendricks received threatening letters and phone calls. Some accused him of using his daughter's tragedy for his own political PR. Others claimed he was inciting hatred against the police. One night, someone broke a window in his home, throwing a brick inside with a note, "Shut your mouth before it's too late." Meanwhile, Miller was under protection, hidden from the public. He was banned from commenting, but his face had already become a symbol of hate for many. He was forced to move, his children were ridiculed at school, and his wife seriously considered divorce. Miller himself was no longer sleeping. He was tormented not only by the threat of losing his career, but also by the realization that he had become part of a machine that had destroyed a child's life. All of this was happening while Lisa stayed at home. Her father tried to protect her from the chaos of the outside world, but he couldn't protect her from herself. She stopped talking. Her little world where Thora had been her eyes, her friend, her safe place, was gone. Now she was trapped in a darkness filled with alien voices that screamed for her, unaware of how deeply they had hurt her. The situation was escalating. Each new day brought more protests, more statements, more conflicts. The country was divided between those who saw the case as a tragic symbol of systemic racism and those who defended the police action. But somewhere in the middle was Lisa, a little girl whose voice was lost in the noise, and while the country argued, she sat in her room, holding an empty collar that would never be used again. Lisa sat on the floor of her room, clutching Thora's collar to her chest. His scent, soaked with time and memory, was the last link between her and her only friend. The silence in the room was crushing, filling everything around her with a cold, clammy feeling of emptiness. There was no light in her world, but Thora used to be its substitute, her eyes, her protection, her faithful companion. Now she was gone. Lisa was alone, and that darkness seemed deeper than ever. The tears had long since dried, leaving only dry, burning pain. She tried to remember Thora's voice, that joyous bark that always lifted her spirits, but her memory was already beginning to fail her, erasing details. That was what frightened her the most. Lisa was afraid of forgetting her, as if with each lost detail a part of herself disappeared. A knock on the door brought her out of the nightmare. It was her father. His voice was soft, but there was a tension in it that he was trying to hide. "Lisa, honey, can I come in?" She didn't answer anything, but he stepped in. His steps were heavy, filled with the weight of responsibility and pain he carried, trying to appear strong for her sake. He knelt down beside her, put his hand on her shoulder. "I know how much pain you're in, but I want you to know that I will do whatever it takes to get justice. That man will answer for what he did." Lisa lifted her head, her face as blank as an endless night. "Justice? What does that mean, Daddy? Will it bring back the Thora? Will it give me my world back?" Those words pierced him like a knife. He was a senator, a man accustomed to solving problems with laws and actions. But now he faced a problem he could not solve with his connections or his power. He couldn't give back to his daughter what was everything to her. "I want you to know that I'm not just fighting for you," he began, trying to make his voice sound confident. "This is bigger than our family. It's about changing the system, to make sure no one else has to go through what you had to." But Lisa shook her head. "I don't want to be a part of this, Daddy. I don't want everyone to look at me and only see me as a victim. I just want Thora back. I want to be left alone." He fell silent, not knowing what to say. She was right. She was a child who had been robbed not only of a friend, but of her peace. And now her story was a weapon in a war she had nothing to do with. Meanwhile, outside this room, the battle has already begun. William Hendricks had hired the best attorneys, assembled a team of activists and lawyers to hold Officer Miller and the entire department accountable. His goal was clear: to seek not only compensation, but to force the system to admit fault. Every day began with calls and meetings. Journalists besieged his house, asking endless questions. He gave interviews, saying that this case was not just a tragedy for his family, but a reflection of a system that ignores the voices of the weak. But in each of these speeches, he had to restrain himself so as not to give away the most important thing. He felt he was losing his daughter. Lisa was getting quieter and quieter. She almost never left the room, avoided talking. Her father noticed that she stopped listening to music, stopped walking even in the garden. It wasn't just grief, it was an emptiness that consumed her. One night, he walked into her room and sat down next to her. "Lisa, I need to know. What can I do? How can I help you?" His voice shook, and for the first time in a long time he allowed himself to show weakness. She sat without turning toward him. You can't bring her back. No one can. And everything else, it doesn't matter. But it mattered to him. He could feel his plans crumbling. He needed to fight to find justice, but he didn't know how to do it without alienating Lisa even more. He wanted her to see him as a father, not a senator fighting for reform. The next morning, he did something he had never done before. He canceled all his meetings and stayed home. Instead of strategizing, he spent the day with Lisa. He talked to her about Thora, about the memories they shared. He listened to her without trying to give advice or channel her pain into his own struggles. "You don't have to forgive him, Lisa," he said, referring to Miller. "No one has the right to make you do that. But you must live, not for him, not for me, but for yourself." These words were not a miracle cure, but something in them echoed in her soul. For the first time in a long time, she looked up and asked, "Do you think, Daddy, if he saw how I felt, it would make a difference?" He hesitated, but answered honestly, "I don't know. Maybe it is, or maybe it's too late." Those words stayed with her like an echo that was repeated over and over again. Forgiveness was unforgivable, but perhaps she could try to find the strength to live, despite the fact that the world had turned out to be so cruel. The city had not yet calmed down. Even months after the tragedy, the shadows of the Lisa incident still lingered in the streets. Protests were replaced by debate, and debate by action that finally began to change an outdated system. But, like any reform, it was all too slow, too late for those who had already lost. Senator Hendricks did everything he could to ensure that his daughter's tragedy would not become a forgotten episode. He put his political might into crafting a law that would increase oversight of police actions, especially in situations involving vulnerable citizens. The law included mandatory training for officers to deal with people with disabilities, as well as imposing strict oversight of use of force incidents. The law, called Tory law, was the first real victory, but Hendricks knew it was only the beginning. Meanwhile, Gerald Miller found himself at the center of an investigation. The commission found his actions unjustified and he was fired from his position. But that wasn't the hardest blow for Miller. He lost the respect of his colleagues, his reputation, and, most importantly, his family. His wife left, taking his children, and he became an outcast in a society that had once seen him as a protector. Miller tried to find solace in excuses, but every night before he went to sleep he saw Lisa's face, her scream, her pain, and it wouldn't let go. For Lisa, however, time stopped. The world around her kept moving, making noise, changing laws, but her world froze at the point where she lost Thora. The psychologists her father had hired tried to help, but nothing worked. Every attempt to talk to her ran into a cold wall of alienation. Lisa didn't want to live in a world where the Thora was gone. She couldn't. Her father tried to be there for her, but every time he walked into her room, he felt helpless. She sat on the bed, clutching the old collar as if it were the only anchor linking her to reality. "Lisa, honey, I'm here," he said, sitting down beside her. But she didn't answer. Sometimes he heard her whisper the name of the Thora in her sleep, and sometimes her silence was louder than any words. Time was moving on. Society began to move on, as it always does. People switched to new scandals, new tragedies, but Lisa stayed in the day the gunshot rang out. It's been a year. On the anniversary of the tragedy, a monument was unveiled in the park where it happened. It was a bronze statue of a dog sitting next to the girl. The statue symbolized not only Lisa and Thora, but all those who lost something important because of the injustice of the system. The ceremony was attended by activists, politicians, and ordinary people who experienced this story as their own. Lisa was there, too. Her father gently led her to the statue, holding her hand. She couldn't see the bronze gleam, couldn't see the flowers that people had placed at the foot of the monument. But she could feel it. Felt the people around her holding back tears as someone quietly said, "It should have been different." When her father brought her closer, she touched the cold metal. Her fingers slid over the shape of the dog, and she felt her chest constrict in pain. "Thora," she whispered for the first time in a long time. The name sounded like a sigh, like the last ray of light in a dark room. After the ceremony, Lisa and her father went home. The next day, her father was going on a business trip related to promoting a new bill. He stopped at her door before leaving. "I'll be back soon, Lisa. You're stronger than you think," he said. But she remained silent. Left alone, Lisa ventured out of the room for the first time in a long time. She walked by feel, her feet treading carefully on the floor, as if she were afraid the world around her would collapse again. She fumbled for Thora's leash that hung by the door and squeezed it. She couldn't replace it. No one could. But she could try to live. The world has changed. The laws had changed. But there was a wound in Lisa's heart that nothing could heal. Life went on, but Thora was forever her light in a dark world that had once been too cruel. Write in the comments what you think about this story. Have you ever experienced injustice or racism in your life? How did you deal with it? Your opinions are very important to us because it is you, our viewers, who make these discussions deep and meaningful. We appreciate each and every one of you and thank you for joining us in raising such important issues. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so that you don't miss other stories that may touch you and make you think. Like this story and share it with others who, like you, care about justice. We wish you a good day filled with kindness and bright moments. Take care of yourself and your loved ones.